Oh, good morning, protege. Of course, good afternoon to my wonderful and favorite 8th period afternoon class. Hey, I hope this direct instructional Zoomcast finds you well. So this is going to be my direct instruction for Thursday. It's a terrific Thursday because I'm here and you're here, and that's what makes it terrific. And it is March, as we are marching into spring. It is March 3rd, 2022. Let's get into it, shall we? You guys know the drill at this point. At this time, everybody should have your ISN open to the right side of the next clean sheet of paper. Top right-hand corner, please make sure that your notes have been dated for today. It's March 3rd, 2022. You need a blue or black pen, multiple colored highlighters, correctable tape. But again, I'm going to respectfully ask all students to refrain from using your correctable tape and your highlighters because it just simply distracts you from, again, your most important task, which is to be listening, observing, and taking really, really, really good copious notes. Okay, topic heading, write this down, top line. We're going to start out with the Yalta Conference, 1945. So again, there's going to be times during this direct instructional Zoomcast that I am going to go a little bit more quickly. Again, I'm trying to pick the pace up, cover a little bit more content, but again, I know I'm repeating myself, and that's okay, is the fact that I love these Zoomcasts because that's one thing this class has done a great job of. I love the way you are able to utilize the technology, to pause the Zoomcast, to give yourself time to get caught up, to rewind it if necessary. And again, I like the fact that everybody's working at your own pace. Again, you're only in competition with you. All right, so go backwards just a little bit. So in order to understand the Yalta Conference, okay, let me just quickly, we did this with my last Zoomcast. Let me just talk again about the big three that were involved. So we're looking at right here, Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of Great Britain. This, of course, is the host of the Yalta Conference held in the Crimea, and that's Joseph Stalin, the, again, dictator of the Soviet Union. And this, of course, is a very frail 63-year-old Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Again, Roosevelt 2 months later, will have passed away from natural causes. Again, when you look at this photograph and you consider what Roosevelt looked like here in 1932, and you're looking at only 13 years later, Roosevelt had aged dramatically. And again, you think about the stress of dealing with the Great Depression, the stress of waging World War II, fighting against the Japanese in the Pacific theater, against the Nazis in Europe, dealing with polio since basically 1921, 1922. You add it all together, he had high blood pressure, and unfortunately, I think that, again, his health simply caught up with him. All right. So again, the Yalta Conference was being held right before the decision to bomb Dresden, Germany. So again, they're looking at the big issue, of course, was Germany. So what's going to happen to Germany? Once again, the Nazis have been defeated. So here's what we're going to do. Let's get into the Yalta Conference. If you would please write this down. So there were three big fundamental issues that were discussed in the Crimea at the Yalta Conference. And this, of course, is going to be February of 1945. Number one, I've already alluded to it earlier. I'll say it again. The big question, again, on the minds of Churchill and Roosevelt and Stalin is what's going to happen to Germany. Now, remember, in February, by early February of 1945, this again is just weeks after the Battle of the Bulge. That was Hitler's last gasp, trying to drive a wedge between the Brits and the Americans. Again, the line, but again, bent, but it didn't break. And that was it. Now it's just a matter of time before the Nazis are going to surrender. The question, of course, is when. But now the bigger question is, so what's going to happen to Germany? What's Germany going to look like? And that, of course, is the million-dollar question about this country right here. Number two, but here's another big issue at the Yalta Conference. Please write this down. So another big issue is the fate of Eastern Europe. And what's going to happen when all these different countries in Eastern Europe are liberated, are freed from Nazi rule that goes all the way back to 1939. So if you direct your attention up to this map, this is the Eastern Front, 1943 through 1944. You got the Soviet Union over here. You've got Czechoslovakia down here. You got Hungary over here, Romania over here. And then over here, of course, is Poland. So all these black lines you see, this represents the Soviet Union's Red Army after, again, eventually defeating the Nazis at that big, significant turning point battle that I taught you about previously, the Battle of Stalingrad. Now they're racing through these different countries, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary. And the big question is, so once the Nazis are kicked out of this country, is the Soviet Union's Red Army is racing towards the eastern part of Germany. But again, what's going to happen to all these countries that were free independent nations prior to the start of World War II? And then finally, the other big issue at the Yalta Conference of 1945 is the future of the Far East. So in particular, the two countries that were being discussed at this point at the Yalta Conference were obviously the Empire of Japan and, of course, China. Now, China's kind of that X factor. You know, remember, China had been occupied by the Japanese since 1937, and technically, one could argue back to 1931 when Japan had taken over Manchuria. But already in 1945, there was a growing sense among the big three, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, that once this war ended, that China was going to emerge as a major player. And obviously, the other big decision is what's going to happen to Japan. Now, remember, in February of 1945, the Japanese, again, were still fighting. They are embracing the concept of Banzai, 10,000 years, this whole idea that you fight to the death. At this point, you're talking about the Battle of Iwo Jima. And then shortly after Iwo Jima is the Battle of Okinawa. This is all part, of course, of the island hopping campaign. And ultimately, again, when you go back to February of 1945, there was still, again, this idea of the Manhattan Project, top secret classified information. Roosevelt had no idea at this point how far along they were, and even if it would be successful. And as we know from our previous unit, eventually the decision was made to drop an atomic bomb first on Hiroshima, August 6, 1945, and then, of course, 3 days later in Nagasaki. But now going back to February, we have to go back in time. Again, what's going to happen, Japan? What's it going to look like? How will Japan eventually be defeated? Again, the whole thought process is you defeat the Nazis first. That's that Europe first campaign strategy. And then once the Nazis are defeated, then you really provide your undivided attention and dealing with the Empire of Japan. All right, let's continue on. So now I've given you the three big topics of conversation at the Yalta Conference. Again, what's Germany going to look like? What's the rest of Eastern Europe going to look like? Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and then obviously what's going to happen to Japan? And again, don't forget about China. They already are sensing that China was going to emerge from the ashes of World War II as a major player. And yes, they will. So there were 5 major important decisions that were made at Yalta. So decision number 1. So one of the big decisions that was made was once the Nazis were again kicked out of countries in Eastern Europe, and a best example of this would be Poland. Now remember, Poland had been again invaded by Nazi Germany way back on September 1st, 1939, and then shortly afterwards, the Soviet Union came from the eastern side. But it was agreed to by the big three at Yalta, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, that Poland once again would be a free and independent country, just like it was on August 31st, 1939, and other countries in Eastern Europe as well, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania. In addition, it was agreed to that these countries, once they were liberated from Nazi control, that they would A, have free elections, and B, you would see the promotion of democracy in these Eastern European countries. And by the way, this is a great example of why you want to add oral notes. And I would draw a line off to the side. You know what this sounds like? This sounds like Woodrow Wilson. This sounds like self-determination. I would add that as a side oral note. Is it coincidence? No, because who was one of the great role models and one of the great inspirations and the mentors politically of Franklin Roosevelt? And the answer is Woodrow Wilson. So the fact that Roosevelt, even though at 63 at this point, he's pretty sick and frail, he's still pushing the envelope for self-determination, because this is something that Woodrow Wilson had talked about way back in 1918 with his 14 points. And again, if you direct your attention up to my laptop screen, this is a map of some of the countries that will eventually be impacted by Yalta. Poland right here. Now, at this point, these were not two countries. This was one country, Czechoslovakia. Decades later, it'll be split into two countries, the Czech Republic and Slovakia. Austria is also going to be impacted by it. Here's Hungary right over here, and then Romania over here. Let's continue on. Number two, second big decision that was made at the Yalta Conference. So number one, Poland, other countries in Eastern Europe, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, free and independent like they were prior to the war, would be allowed free elections and, of course, be allowed to embrace democracy. Number two, it was agreed to that Germany, once Germany was defeated and the Germans, or let's be more specific, the Nazis had unconditionally surrendered, you would witness what's called the zonal occupation of Germany. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to draw 4 lines down here. We're going to add some side oral notes here. So Germany would basically be divided into 4 different zones. This zone right here would be controlled by the Brits. I would add that as a side note. This zone right here would be controlled by France. Recognize the name, and that's, of course, the flag. This zone right here would be occupied by the Soviet Union. Draw a line off to the side and add that. And then this zone of Germany right there would be controlled by the United States of America. So the 4 Allied powers would, again, at this point, I want to emphasize, this was not supposed to be permanent. This was supposed to be temporary. And the thought process is occupy these respective zones, begin the process of rebuilding Germany, because the big 3 realized that Germany would need to be rebuilt. But again, there was an understanding that this was not supposed to be a permanent arrangement, that at some point in the not too distant future, that the 4 zones would be put back together like Humpty Dumpty. Remember the nursery rhyme? And then Humpty Dumpty would be put back together again. The question is this the way the story is going to play out? We'll see. All right, number 3, third big decision. So number 1, of course, Poland, Eastern Europe, free from Nazi rule, free elections, democracy. 2, Germany would be temporarily divided up into 4 occupational zones, each zone occupied by one of your allies, the Brits, the French, the Americans, and the Soviets. Again, begin the process of rebuilding, and at some point, the 4 zones would be put back together again, and Germany would become a whole country. Number 3, now here's the next thing. So the thought process is, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when Nazi Germany surrendered. And then once Nazi Germany surrendered, then the Soviet Union, led by, of course, evil dictator Joseph Stalin, they would then declare war on Japan. But this would not happen until Germany surrendered. And as we know, being armchair quarterbacks, we can look into the future, because the future then is our past. And again, eventually Nazi Germany will eventually unconditionally surrender, VE Day, May 8th, 1945. So again, what's going to happen is already in February of 1945, the whole thought process was a full-scale invasion of Japan. Remember Operation Downfall, you would have the Soviets coming down from the north, you'd have the Americans coming from basically the east. Let's continue on. Number 4, fourth big decision that was made at the Yalta Conference in February of 1945, China. Now, again, I said this before and I'll say it again. Even though China had been militarily occupied by the Japanese, technically since 1937, but I'm willing to go back to 1931 with Manchuria. But again, already the thought process is China was going to emerge as a major player in the 20th century and now into the 21st century. China would regain what's called its sovereignty. That's a big word. I love this word. So I'd like you to draw a line off to the side. Sovereignty, can you guys say sovereignty? Good job. Sovereignty means the right to rule. And China, since it controlled Manchuria way back in 1931, it would regain its right to control this area that had been part of China for thousands and thousands of years. And then finally, number 5. So I'm just going to introduce this. I'm going to go into a lot more detail on this later on. But already in February of 1945, the big 3, Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin, agreed that the League of Nations just simply did not work. Go back to Manchuria in 1931. Go back to Ethiopia in 1935 when Italy invaded it. Go back to the Rhineland, 1936, 35, 36. Go back to what happened with the Anschluss with Austria in 1938. Go back to just the policy of appeasement. And time again, every time there was an act of aggression, the League of Nations chose to basically do nothing. The sanctions, minimal. So at this point, it kind of reminds me of when, again, the founding fathers realized that with the Articles of Confederation, our first constitution, it just wasn't working. And so rather than revise it, tear it up and start a brand new constitution. In this case, we're going to tear up the League of Nations as an organization, and we're going to create a brand new organization that's going to replace it. And it's called, of course, the United Nations. And if you direct your attention up to my, again, screen, this is a photograph of the United Nations meeting in its headquarters in New York City. I'm going to definitely come back and talk more about the United Nations later on when we get into the presidency of the very first Cold War president, who I'm going to introduce today, and that, of course, is Harry S. Truman. All right, finally. So we've talked about the big, topics of conversation. We talked about some of the big decisions. What's Eastern Europe going to look like? What's Germany going to look like? The creation of the United Nations. What's going to happen to China? What's going to happen to Japan? When are the Soviets going to get involved in the Pacific theater? So now what I want to do is I want to dovetail back, and I want to now tie together all the loose ends. So the Yalta Conference, February of 1945. This will be the last time that Franklin Roosevelt will have an opportunity of spending some really extended period of time with his distant cousin, Winston Churchill, because as I told you, Roosevelt is going to die 2 months later of natural causes at the age of 63. The world, and especially America, was stunned by this. So the Yalta Conference was important for 6 reasons. So number 1, first reason. So this is what I call Joseph Stalin's broken promises. Remember who we're dealing with. Go back to the non-aggression pact when Stalin and Hitler agreed to, again, not attack one another. And you have to ask the question, why would these 2 individuals who were ideologically so different, one was a fascist, one was a communist, why would they want to negotiate a deal with one another? And the answer is, for that time being, they needed each other. Hitler needed Stalin to stay on the sidelines in order to invade Poland. Stalin was just simply buying himself some time to continue building up his military and eventually dealing with Hitler. So when Stalin talked about the idea of when the Soviet Union's Red Army swept through parts of Eastern Europe, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and of course my ancestral homeland besides Slovakia, Poland, and he said, oh yeah, there's going to be free elections. Oh yeah, we're going to allow democracy. No, he's not. That was not going to happen. So basically, everything he promised about Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania simply was not true. And the bottom line is, when you look at Joseph Stalin and you're dealing with an evil dictator, Joseph Stalin was like Pinocchio. And no, I'm not comparing Joseph Stalin with Pinocchio. Pinocchio, again, was a little boy whose nose grew when he was telling a lie. Joseph Stalin was simply telling one big whopping lie, a huge one. He was being utterly disingenuous with both, again, President Roosevelt, who tended to be a little more trusting. On the other hand, Churchill already was developing some deep skepticism of who Joseph Stalin really was, and could Joseph Stalin truly be trusted? Let's move on. So why is Stalin doing this? Why is he breaking his promises? Because he never had any intention of allowing free elections in these countries that then Soviet Union liberated. Because what Joseph Stalin wanted to do was to make all of those countries what we call satellite nations. Now, I'm going to talk about satellite nations momentarily, but what I'm talking about is all of these countries here. Here's the Soviet Union right here. And I would draw a couple of lines off to the side. I'd like you to add this as some side notes. So these countries are all going to be satellite nations. So we're going to go down here. Albania, I would add that as a side note. And if I'm going too quickly, pause the Zoomcast. Give yourself a chance to get caught up. Good job. Bulgaria, right here. Romania, right here. Hungary is going to be a satellite nation. Going further up, Czechoslovakia over here. Poland up here. And I'm going to throw a curveball at you. You notice that this country right here is the same color as the Soviet Union and all these countries in Eastern Europe, and that's East Germany. Now remember, Stalin had agreed to this idea of the zonal occupation of Germany, that the big four allied countries, the Brits, the French, the Americans, and the Soviets would temporarily occupy a zone of Germany and eventually allow Germany to come back together again at some point in history, or some point in time, I should say. That's not going to happen. The reality is Germany is going to end up being split in half, as we're going to find out. Number two, the second reason why the Yalta Conference was important is because now, again, the talk was, well, what's China going to look like? Is China going to end up becoming a democracy like the United States and its allies? Is China going to end up becoming a communist nation like Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union? And the answer is that decision is not going to be made at Yalta. It's not going to be made by Roosevelt or I should not say Eisenhower, sorry about that, by Roosevelt, Churchill, there we go, and Joseph Stalin. But instead, it's the Chinese are going to end up making that decision themselves. Now, what's going to happen is you're going to see shortly after World War II ends, China's going to experience what's called the Red Revolution. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this. I'm going to spend a lot more time talking about this later on, but I want to give you guys kind of a preview of it. So basically 2 years after World War II ended and the Empire of Japan was defeated, a civil war is going to break out in China. So as I stated, it's the Chinese who are going to end up making the decision what direction they're going to go. So there were two sides and two key players. So I'm going to have you write this down, but I'm going to dovetail back to these guys again. It's really important to understand the Chinese Red Revolution because it has not only an impact on the 20th century, it's also still impacts us today in 2022. So one of the key players was this gentleman right here. His name is pronounced Chiang Kai-shek. And he is going to be leading the forces, not so much, I put democracy, more of nationalism, but I'll throw democracy in anyway, because he's going to ally himself with the United States of America. And if you direct your attention up to my, again, desktop screen, take a good look at this guy. I'm going to definitely come back to him again. That's Chiang Kai-shek. And then the other key player in the Chinese Red Revolution, so it's not going to be the Americans or the Soviets who make that decision. It's going to be the Chinese who make that decision. And the other key player is a gentleman by the name of Mao Zedong. And he is going to lead the forces of communism, very similar to what, again, the Soviet Union had embraced going way back to the end of the, again, Russian Revolution, 1917, all the way through literally 1922. And if you direct your attention up to my laptop screen, take a good look at this guy. That's Mao Zedong. We're going to definitely come back to both Mao and Chiang later on when I get into more detail on the Chinese Red Revolution. It's that important. Moving on, number 3. So the third reason why Yalta is important, and we're going to be getting more into this as we get into chapter 38, the origins of the Cold War. So by the time you get to Yalta, it's becoming more and more apparent that even though they're, quote, allies, and they're supposed to be friends, and I, again, say it euphemistically with the bunny ears, the reality is there is now beginning this growing fear and this growing suspicion of the spread of communism. Meaning that when Stalin was talking about free elections and allowing democracy and self-determination to take root in Eastern Europe, he was being utterly dishonest and disingenuous. And instead, what he wanted to see was the political and economic ideology that the Soviet Union embraced, communism, that was going to take root in countries in Eastern Europe. And that was the fear that, again, not so much Franklin Roosevelt. I think Franklin Roosevelt at this point was dealing with some health issues. And I think Roosevelt still had some measure of trust and faith in Stalin. Winston Churchill already had some serious concerns about Joseph Stalin. There's a famous song by one of my favorite bands called The Who, with the British invasion from the 60s. And one of their great songs is called We Won't Get Fooled Again. And one of the seminal lines from the song is, meet the new boss, same as the old boss. So you go from Adolf Hitler, and Hitler's basically replaced by Joseph Stalin. So what's going to happen is, so now as the Nazis are being kicked out, but now they are being replaced by the Soviet Union and communism, the hammer and the sickle. So why is it that communism would be an issue with the Allies, the Americans, the Brits, the French? Because number one, if you study the communism that takes root in the Soviet Union, there is a rejection of religion. And again, this is something that's very important to countries like the United States. The United States takes pride in freedom of religion, allowing people to worship as they choose. That's in our Constitution. That's in our first Bill of Rights. Again, part of our amendments to the Constitution. Number two, in communism, there's no private property. The government basically controls everything. And this is something that's part of, again, capitalism, a free enterprise system. So there's this dynamic, this kind of, butting of the heads between two different political and economic ideologies. And it's starting to become more noticeable. You're starting to begin to see bits and pieces of it at the Yalta Conference. And number three, what you notice about the Soviet Union, and you're going to eventually notice about countries in Eastern Europe that are, quote, liberated by the Soviets, only to be taken over by the Soviets, is you see a basic, again, denial of basic rights and freedoms. Things that we as Americans simply take for granted. It's part of our Bill of Rights. It's part of our Constitution. It's in our DNA, not so much if you're living in the Soviet Union and these countries in Eastern Europe. And that dovetails into number four. So 3 and 4 actually are connected. So you've got, again, this idea, this growing fear of communism, encroaching into countries beyond just the Soviet Union. And what you start to see right at the time of Yalta and the months afterwards is you're going to start to see Soviet aggression over smaller countries in Eastern Europe. So again, the third and the fourth reasons why Yalta was so important, absolutely, I would draw a line and connect the two because one dovetails off of the other. So what's going on? So in order to understand the Soviet aggression over countries in Eastern Europe, so these are the origins of what we call the Cold War, this war of words, this war of ideologies, political and economic ideologies between the United States and the Soviet Union. So you got to go back to 1939. The Nazis invade Poland. But remember, before that, they had invaded Czechoslovakia back in April. And then several months later, they went into Poland on September 1st. This marks the beginning of World War II. The Nazis weren't done. They went into other countries, Hungary, Romania, took it over. And so these countries that the Nazis had been occupying for literally 6 years, they're still recovering in 1945. So they were, and I would draw a line off to the side, they were in no condition to try to fight back against the Soviet Union's Red Army. So now the question is, who's vulnerable? So number one of the areas that absolutely is vulnerable to be taken over by the Soviet Union, again, in the latter stages of World War II and the early stages of the Cold War, would be your 3 Baltic states, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia. If you study the history of the Baltic states, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, they've had a very tenuous and very, again, challenging relationship, if you will, first with Russia under the Tsars, and now you're dealing with, of course, Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union. So again, you've got Lithuania right here, Latvia right here, Estonia over here. Now they have Russia here, but again, at this point, there is no Russia. Russia is one of your republics as part of the Soviet Union. Number 2, Eastern Europe is also vulnerable too. So not just your 3 Baltic states. And what are we talking about again? You're looking at countries that you wrote down before: Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland. All of those countries were liberated and freed by the Soviets, but they're not liberated. It's just simply they kicked the Nazis out, and now they're going to stick around, not for a couple of days, not for a couple of weeks, not for a couple of months, not for a couple of years, but how about a couple of decades? So now the question is, so why is it that the Soviet Union is taking over your three Baltic states and taking over these countries in Eastern Europe? So now I'm going to dovetail back to what I talked about earlier. I'd like you to write this down, because the reason is what Stalin is trying to do is he's trying to take these countries, the Baltic states, your countries in Eastern Europe, and he's trying to make them into what we call satellite nations. Now, the question is, what do we mean by a satellite nation? Well, I would like you to draw a line off to the side. We're going to add some little oral notes to this. So think of a satellite, how a satellite circles around the Earth. It kind of protects us, kind of keeps us informed of what's going on outside in outer space, outside the Earth's atmosphere. Well, it's kind of the same thing. So what Stalin says is, look, twice Russia and then now the Soviet Union in 1945 had been invaded. So what Stalin's rationale is, and I would add this as a side oral note, these countries in Eastern Europe and your Baltic states, again, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, they would act as a buffer. They would act as protection of the Soviet Union. But at the same time, the Soviets would then argue that they're also protecting these countries from aggression from countries like Germany. And at this point, Germany is no condition to practice any aggression. But that's another story for another time. Number 5, fifth reason why the Yalta Conference was important. So again, one thing I think is really important is that it's really easy to take the perspective only of the American and the Allied side. They had legitimate concerns about Joseph Stalin. They had legitimate concerns about Stalin's broken promises. They had legitimate concerns about Stalin's promise to liberate these countries in Eastern Europe and the Baltics, and he never had intention of doing it. He wanted them to become satellite nations, and they would all be forced to embrace communism. But on the other hand, again, and I want to make this very clear, I'm not excusing Joseph Stalin, and I'm not excusing his aggression. Yes, it is aggression, what he's doing. I'm just explaining why he's doing what he's doing. And then you have to look at the two sides to formulate and draw your own conclusions. So now from the Soviets' point of view, from Joseph Stalin's point of view, he has some serious concerns about the Allies, going back to the Yalta Conference in February of 1945. So number one, Joseph Stalin, especially as you fast forward a couple of months, when he learns of this weapon that the Americans had developed as part of the Manhattan Project, and that, of course, is the atomic bomb. So even back with Yalta, there was a growing fear with Joseph Stalin. Now, the Soviets had taken a real severe beating at the hands of the Nazis going back to 1941. There were several times in 41 and 42 that it looked like the Nazis were going to take over the Soviet Union. They came very, very close, and they caused a lot of death and a lot of destruction. So it wasn't just Eastern Europe that had to recuperate and rebuild after what the Nazis did, their onslaught, if you will. But one of the things that Stalin was worried about is the fear that the United States might decide to attack the Soviet Union. Remember, outside of the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States did not witness one single major battle. Whereas you look at the Soviet Union, look at Stalingrad, the siege of Leningrad, which was against St. Petersburg. The Soviets had suffered terribly. Again, not making an excuse for Stalin, not making an excuse for the spread of communism and aggression. I'm just explaining what the whole story is. And he said that America was in much better shape. He could see it already in recuperating from World War II. The Soviets had a lot of rebuilding to do. And so the fear, especially from Stalin, and I would draw a line off to the side, this is what Stalin was afraid of. Not at Yalta, but at Potsdam, and that's months later. He was fearful that the United States, if they were willing to use not one, but 2 atomic bombs on Japan, and I would draw a line off to the side, that's what he was afraid of. Not the United States invading the Soviet Union, but rather dropping an atomic bomb on, say, Moscow. And then this might even be a bigger concern that Stalin had. And this is the one that Stalin really had concerns about. And again, I'm not excusing Stalin, just like I never excused Hitler becoming Hitler. I just explained Hitler. But again, think about Stalin's perspective. In his lifetime, twice Germany has invaded. First Russia in 1914, and then the Soviet Union in 1941. So when Churchill and especially Roosevelt are talking about rebuilding Germany and allowing Germany to rebuild itself and not make the mistakes that were made post-World War I. The fear that Stalin had is that if you have a rebuilt Germany right on your border, okay, this was Stalin's bigger fear, maybe even bigger than the idea of the United States dropping an atomic bomb on the Soviet Union. Was this fear of seeing German troops looking for payback after World War II, being rebuilt and coming after the Soviet Union for a third time. Again, just to reiterate, I'm not excusing Stalin. I am not making any exceptions for his aggression towards, again, Eastern Europe and the Baltic states. I'm just simply explaining where he's coming from, pure and simple. All right, I want you guys to skip a full page. I want you to go to right side of the next clean sheet of paper. All right, make certain that you date your notes again for today. It's March 3rd. We are marching into spring 2022. So we're going to shift gears now. We're going to move away from the Yalta Conference. We have to talk about a new president, because this new president is going to have a huge impact on American history, because he is the first president to become president during what we call the Cold War, the war of words, the war of political and economic ideologies between the United States and the Soviet Union. All right, so here we go. So it's April 1945. So this is, again, a couple months after the Yalta Conference. Franklin Roosevelt was 63 years old. Again, I'm going to be 60 in a couple of months. Not putting myself on a pedestal. I'm very, very lucky. I've been able to take good care of myself, watch my diet, live a healthy lifestyle, exercise, and I don't have the stress that again, Franklin Roosevelt dealt with. I didn't deal with the Great Depression. I didn't deal with fighting World War II. I didn't deal with a horrific disease like polio. That's why, again, he had aged so rapidly. But in April of 1945, in Warm Springs, Georgia, the unthinkable happened. Roosevelt's been around as president for 13 years. I think the average American thought he was going to be around forever. And in April of 1945, Franklin Roosevelt dies unexpectedly. The American people are stunned. I mean, Roosevelt had guided the American people through the Great Depression, through most of World War II. And as I say every year when I teach about the end of World War II, and now we're into the Cold War, it's one of those historical injustices, because I think that, again, if anybody deserved to see truly the end of World War II, it was Franklin Roosevelt. He had earned that right in navigating the waters. But that's not the way, as we know, the story plays out. Now, here's why the death of, again, Roosevelt ties in with our story. So I'd like you to write this down. Now, Joseph Stalin got to know Franklin Roosevelt, especially going back to the Yalta Conference. And I'm not saying they were BFFs. They weren't. But there was an understanding they had it with each other. You know, Roosevelt was a master psychologist. He was able to size people up really well. And he kind of understood Stalin. I don't think he really understood what Stalin really was about and the evil that Stalin was responsible for. But Roosevelt felt he could work with Stalin. On the other hand, here's the other key. Joseph Stalin knew Franklin Roosevelt, and he felt comfortable around Franklin Roosevelt. Now, Roosevelt's gone. He's going to be replaced by a new guy. And from Joseph Stalin's perspective, and again, I keep repeating myself, I'm not excusing Stalin at all. I'm just saying from Stalin's point of view, all right, who's the new guy going to be? How is the new guy going to be? Is he going to afford me the same respect that Franklin Roosevelt demonstrated to Stalin at, for example, the Yalta Conference? So the new guy is not going to be BFFs with Joseph Stalin by any stretch of the imagination. And he had a very different personality than Franklin Roosevelt. And no, he is not going to have a very good relationship with Joseph Stalin at all. And so the new president of the United States is this guy right here. I'd actually introduced him way back in World War I briefly. His name was Harry Truman. So Harry Truman was Franklin Roosevelt's running mate in the election in 1944. So when Roosevelt was elected president, again, Harry Truman became vice president. Now that Franklin Roosevelt passed away in April of 1945, according to the Constitution, if anything happens to the president of the United States of America, it's going to be the vice president who takes over, and that is Harry Truman. So Harry Truman now is our 33rd president. He's not elected in 1944 as president. He was elected vice president, and he simply becomes president in 1945, replacing Franklin Roosevelt. In 1948, Harry Truman runs for the presidency. We'll talk about that. He defeats Thomas E. Dewey and becomes the elected president from 1949 until 1953. Again, Harry Truman chooses to not run for the presidency again in 1952. All right, so a little bit of information. I just want to share a couple points with you guys. So number one, I always do this. I love to talk about Harry Truman. Again, I'm not trying to be biased. I am always trying to be objective, but I say to students again and again and again, I thoroughly enjoy teaching about Harry Truman. And again, I think Harry Truman was a pretty remarkable president. He was not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but I think Harry Truman, in my humble opinion, is one of the most underrated presidents we ever had. And he's also a really interesting president. So before we get into what he actually did as our first Cold War president and the 33rd president, let me share some interesting facts with you. So number one, very different upbringing from that of Franklin Roosevelt. So Harry Truman was born to a Missouri farm family in 1884. So he was born a year after Franklin Roosevelt. But again, and I would add this as a side note, so Franklin Roosevelt was a Northerner. Harry Truman was a Southerner. Franklin Roosevelt grew up in a more urban area just outside of New York City. Again, Harry Truman grew up in a rural area, grew up on a farm. And the other thing too is when you look at them, it's just because of their upbringing. And also one other thing I forgot to mention, Harry Truman growing up on a small farm was poor, didn't have a lot of money. Parents didn't have a lot of money, whereas Franklin Roosevelt was filthy, stinking rich. So you add all those key points together, the dynamic, the personalities of these guys are going to be very, very different. And by the way, just as kind of interesting side note, draw a line off to the side, add this in. So when you talk about a famous Missouri farm kid, another famous Missouri farm kid besides Harry Truman was, maybe you recognize this guy, Uncle Walt, Walt Disney. He grew up on a farm in Missouri like Harry Truman did. He was around a lot of, again, farm animals. I don't know, mice and dogs. And Uncle Walt, Walt Disney, had a great love for art. And he took his love of arts and being around animals. And well, it's a small world after all. I think you know the story with that one. And by the way, here's another great connection. Walt Disney actually was born and raised in this home right here. That's in Chicago, my hometown. So Walt Disney actually was born and raised in Chicago, but as a young boy, his family moved to this farm in Missouri. So interesting, the connections, how you're able to weave this information together in telling the whole story. By the way, another interesting little tidbit about Harry Truman. Harry Truman also is the only American president of the 20th century who only had a high school diploma. He didn't go to college. In the case of somebody like a Franklin Roosevelt, he went to Harvard. Roosevelt had parents who could afford it. His cousin Theodore went to Harvard. So there's a legacy going on. Harry Truman had definitely the academic chops. He had the brains to go, but his parents couldn't afford to send him. Harry Truman, by the way, just because he didn't go to college doesn't mean he wasn't a bright dude. He was a really smart guy, a voracious reader. Again, I always say to students, I want to see all of you go to college, but there's more to learning and more becoming a well-rounded person than just saying you went to college. It's also reading, it's expanding your horizons. And that's something that Harry Truman was able to do. Another interesting tidbit about Harry Truman, write this down. This is important because it molds and shapes Harry Truman, not only as an adult, but in becoming our first Cold War president. So yes, Harry Truman fought in World War I. And if you direct your attention up to my laptop screen, that's a photograph of Harry Truman, again, in his military uniform. He was in the AEF. Now, I want you to notice that Harry Truman wore glasses. That's an important part of the story. So Harry Truman was 32 years old when he joined the AEF. He didn't have to join. He actually, at this point, was too old to register for the Selective Service Act in 1917. So Harry Truman, even though he didn't have to register and was not going to be drafted, but Harry Truman felt a strong feeling, a dedication, a sense of loyalty to join the American military, and he did. But now what's interesting, I told you, he wore glasses. And you have to pass an eye exam in order to be admitted to the military. And twice, Harry Truman took the eye exam, and both times he failed. He took the exam the third time and passed with flying colors. You remember the story? I think I told you this about World War I. And what Harry Truman did was, no, he didn't wear his glasses. He just simply memorized the eye chart. That's how he's able to pass the exam. That is somebody that really wanted to get into the military. So the other thing about Harry Truman, please write this down, is Harry Truman was a highly decorated veteran of World War I who rose to the rank of captain. He was an officer leading guys that were 10, almost 15 years younger than him, almost, not quite, into battle. And again, the thing that I would mention about this point, this is again a great example of why you want to add oral notes, draw a line off to the side, is again, leadership. When you become an officer in the military, whether you're in the AEF or you're in the United States Navy or the Marines, and you become again an officer, you have to demonstrate something, a quality, and that quality is leadership. And that's something you're going to need when you become president of the United States of America. You know, like deciding whether or not you want to use the atomic bomb or launch Operation Downfall and again, launch a full-scale invasion of Japan. You have to demonstrate leadership, and Harry Truman will. Whether you agree or disagree, that's another story for another time. 1920, another, again, I think important part of our story. So Harry Truman in 1920 opened what's called a haberdashery shop in Kansas City, Missouri. So Harry Truman returns back from World War I, like a lot of veterans of war, tries to figure out what he's going to do in his life. So there's no talk about going into politics at this point. Harry Truman was perfectly content being a business person. So if you direct your attention up to my laptop screen, this is a photograph of Harry Truman and his haberdashery shop. Now, here's what I want you guys to do. I want you to pause the Zoomcast. Take about a minute to 2 minutes. Draw a line off to the side. Study this photograph. Here's Harry Truman right here, and these are 3 of his employees. Take a look at this photograph. What do you think a haberdashery shop is? Take about a minute to draw a little line off to the side. See if you can figure it out. Develop those analytical, critical thinking skills. I'm going to continue on, of course. So a haberdashery shop is a men's fine men's clothing store, or a men's fine clothing store. That sounds even better. As a matter of fact, again, in those days, I mean, dudes, you always saw dudes wearing suits and ties and caps like these guys in the back. They're wearing derbies. And good luck, by the way, trying to find a photograph of Harry Truman not wearing a suit and tie. Men, especially in those times, were a lot more formal than our society is today. Just saying, that's just the way it was, not passing judgment. So what's the end result? Harry Truman proved to be not a good businessman. He ends up going bankrupt. Now, here's where the story is important. So what happened to the business? Now draw a line off to the side. And the answer is, remember after I taught you about World War I, America went into an economic recession? That's what happened. This was not the right time to open up a men's haberdashery shop because people are not working. Jobs are being lost, and there's no unemployment compensation in those days. So if you're not working, you're not making money. And who has money then? If you don't have any money, who's going to go to a men's haberdashery shop to buy a new tie or a new suit or a new hat? So the business ends up failing. But this is an important part of the story. So Harry Truman refused to hide his bankruptcy. There's a stigma. There's a social stigma when people declare bankruptcy. It can be very embarrassing. But Harry Truman would not hide his bankruptcy. A lot of times when people declare what's called Chapter 11, okay? And that means that you basically apply to have all the money you owe, your debts are all wiped clean. But there's still that stigma about being bankrupt. But Harry Truman refused to do that. His point was, I owe people money. And I know it's going to be a while before I can pay it back, but I'm not going to run away from the, again, bankruptcy. I'm not going to hide from it. I'm not going to make excuses. Yeah, I opened up my shop at the wrong time during an economic recession. I am going to accept my financial responsibilities. And so what he does is for the next 15 years until sometime around 1935, it's going to take him 15 years. But over the next 15 years, Harry Truman owed $30,000, which in those days was a lot of money. That's well over $100,000 today. But over the next 15 years, anybody that he owed money to, he will pay them back. And to me, I tell this story again and again, because to me, and I would draw a little side note off to the side, this is about integrity. This is about character. And that's why I always tell this story about the fact that here's a guy that very easily could have walked away from the bankruptcy and had all his debts wiped clean. He wouldn't do that. He accepted full responsibility. He didn't blame the recession. He didn't blame his employees. He said, listen, I just wasn't a good business person. And I'll even go back to the fact when he had joined the Army, the AEF. He didn't have to join, but he did. And here was a guy that was almost 35 years old. He was 32 years old when he joined the military, leading much younger guys in the battle, but he demonstrated leadership, character, integrity. These are qualities and these are attributes, in my opinion, that a president needs to have to be a successful president. So the question is, so now that he's failed as a businessman, what's Harry Truman going to do with his life? And the answer is, that's another story for another time. We'll see. So ladies and gentlemen, at this point, I would like everybody to please go and take out your correctable tape, clean up everything in your ISN, no crossing out, no tracing over. This is a portfolio of your absolute best effort. And now I'd like for you to take your multiple colored highlighters, tip of the tip, and focus on the words that you can visualize in your mind, the persons, places, and things. Because you're still not done. Remember, you have to go back and review your ISN 10 to 15 minutes. You practice for cricket, you practice for basketball or soccer. Why aren't you practicing for school? It's no different. Every day you've got to build to develop that mastery, that educational foundation. If you have an opportunity, hand your ISN to your mom or dad or an older brother or sister that had me maybe years ago and teach them. Channel your inner Mr. Bonk. Tell them the story of the Yalta Conference. What were some of the big topics? What about Germany? What's going to happen in Eastern Europe? What's going to be the outcome? What were some of the big decisions that were made? Remember how Germany was going to be divided up into 4 occupational zones, but it was supposed to be a temporary thing? Is that how it played out? Remember how Stalin had promised that Eastern Europe would have free elections and democracy would be allowed to take root, self-determination? Is that how the story played out? What eventually happened to China? Did they go democratic? Did they go communist? Who made that decision? And what about Harry Truman? Who was Harry Truman? Was his upbringing similar to that of Franklin Roosevelt? Did he have a similar personality? How did his participation in World War I and opening that haberdashery shop in Missouri, and then eventually the shop closing and declaring bankruptcy, how did that mold and shape the man who later on will become president of the United States of America? You tell me. So thank you again for allowing me the opportunity of sharing some wonderful information and content with you, again, about the Cold War. And as I always like to say, when I wrap up one of my Zoomcasts, the story may have ended today, but the saga is going to continue tomorrow. And the rest, as we say, everyone, is history. Peace out, everybody. Thank you so much. And as always, please be well.